done. So Logan, it's wonderful to have you. You're a fellow of ARI, have been for some years, and have been out there doing some really interesting work. But that's not all that I'd like to speak to you about. For me, vital to understanding who anyone is to have some idea where they come from, where you come from. So would you mind starting there? Where were you born? How did you grow up?
Well, firstly, thanks for the opportunity to share with you some of the experience. Yes, I was born on the Cape Flats in Cape Town, a place called Alsis River. We had to leave there in '69. The strip of land we lived on was declared white, so we were evicted through the Blue Areas Act. I landed up in a place called Hanover Park, which is very much in the news today. One of the most dangerous places to live in South Africa. I grew up there, then Mitchell's Plain, and in my youth days played a bit of sports, but got involved in politics at the age of 16. Initially through the Young Christian Workers, Catholic Workers Movement, 1980 schools boycotts, then later the formation of the United Democratic Front, ANC structures, and basically as a young person grew up as part of the sort of revolutionary movement.
Was your family engaged in politics?
Nobody was engaged in politics in my family. In fact, in the beginning they were pretty much against it. I think the thing that shifted it for them was when I went to jail.
Yes.
I don't think, despite what your mother thinks of your activities, once you're in trouble, she supports you. And I think after a few visits to the prison, my mother became hard.
And politicized. What was she like?
My mother was an interesting woman. She was. She had only had grade 2 education. She taught herself to read and write by reading the Bible. She was a domestic sleep-in servant for most of her life. And yet she was the chairman of the rugby club supporters for 20 years. So she was a very dynamic woman, knew what she wanted. Yes, I was very close to her.
Okay, great. And you went straight into a series of organizations that you worked in and learned from. But were there any individuals who were important in catalyzing your interest in politics? Teachers, people in the community?
Yes, I think like with many other people at the time, when you live where we live, you really get influenced by the church. And so I was very much a church young man. There was a time when I went to church every day. Can't say that anymore, but I did. And it was really through youth programs that we started to learn about Jane Pittman and Rosa Parks, watching these movies on a Sunday. Because you either go to church and play football or you join a gang. And so we kind of had refuge in the church, and that is when I learned a little bit about social consciousness. And then, of course, came the 1980 boycotts. And
Were you still at school?
I wasn't only still at school. The 1980 boycott started at my school by a committee
Which
that I headed, Crystal High School.
Oh, you went Crystal? Okay.
Yes. And that is when we started that boycott, that became a national boycott in 1980, we did not do that as very conscious political activists. All we wanted to do was, we were boycotting because we didn't have textbooks by March, and the windows were broken and the teachers were drunk. And we called the first parents' meeting in the community. We were only 16. And at this first meeting came this bunch of bearded, long-haired, coat-wearing students from the University of the Western Cape and handed out pamphlets at our meeting and started long live Azania, and we didn't know what Azania was. And we sat in this meeting, and onto the stage walks, my memory fails me, it was either Ibrahim Patel or Zaki Ahmad. I'm never until today sure. They were both there,
Okay.
but one of the two of them walks onto the stage while we're sitting, because it's our meeting, we're 16 years old kids, called a public meeting. Yeah, one of them, and I'm sure it was Zaki, walks up on the stage and starts explaining to the parents at the meeting, the problem here is the system. The system this and the system. They explain how the system and apartheid works. We just wanted the windows fixed.
And the books.
And the books. And eventually I said to my fellow organizer of the meeting, because firstly you need to understand English is not my language.
Yes.
And yeah, he speaks about the system and big English words, and conditions and objectives and stuff. And we didn't speak English at the time. And I said to my friend, who is the system? I thought you were talking about someone. And that was really my introduction into hardcore politics, because we then had to begin to understand that what we're experiencing daily has got to do with a system that is created to oppress. So that is how that happened. But in the political side of my life, probably few people that have influenced me greatly. Firstly, Johnny Issel,
of course.
Great revolutionary leader who taught me a lot of strategy, tactics, moreover bravery and fearlessness, which is what we had as young people. Later on, Trevor Manuel played a big role. In between that, people that really, really moved me and influenced my life is Oscar Mpeta, trade unionist, great man. Dorothy Sihlangu, also chairperson of the Women's Organization. And a number of other people, largely Western Cape based, because that is what we were, that shaped young lives like mine. I'll always be grateful.
Okay. It's an interesting thing to think that whilst we were underprivileged financially, the privileges that came from working and learning from those people were huge. And so there's a different layer of privilege that people who have your history carry into their adult lives. So, just an observation, you went from school essentially to the UDF, I think is what you were saying. And were you engaged only in the public face of the UDF, or were you in some of the underground structures as well?
It's an interesting question that I only understood many, many years later. So by 1983, we were called upon by the ANC in exile to form mass organizations post-1981. And the theme was, there was a book by Carlos Carter called From Protest to Challenge. And then the next volume said From Mobilization to Organization. And the ANC then said that we must learn from 76, we must learn from the bannings, we must learn from 73. What do we take out of the 80s? And part of that was we must now consolidate. So we had to form civic organizations and trade unions and youth organizations and so on. So we formed the Cape Youth Congress. And I mean, I think I was 19 when I had to go to the factory gate because we were starting a trade union. I've never worked in my life, but we had to start a trade union. And so those were the things you are called upon to do. And so we had to do that. But part of organizing, you see, was to do things you've never done before. I mean, Johnny Issel gave me a job. Now, I'm going to confess something, that if it wasn't for Google Maps, I'll forever be lost because I cannot read maps. My job as an 18-year-old young activist, when we did community work, was to take a map. I had to go take a train to the municipality, city of Cape Town. I had to buy a map, cost me R2. Now he'd give me the R2 because I didn't have R2. And to get to the station, to the city, I need to borrow somebody's weekly ticket because there's no money to borrow. Then you get the map. Then I must take that map and pieces of paper and a pen, and I must draw sub-hand maps. Because on Sunday we're going to do community work. There'll be 50 to 60 people. And my job is to hand maps to groups of 4 people. And that map will show the street. It is hand drawn. And I had to learn to read a map. I probably didn't do a good job of that. I still can't read maps, but I did those maps. And then my job was to brief the team going out. And whilst briefing, you get looked at, Johnny Eastle and others, including me. So we're going to sell a newspaper called Grassroots, was knock and drop. We must introduce the UDF to people. So somebody has cooked the food, somebody's organized the transport. I got the little maps that I'm handing out to the groups. Names were written down. In the meantime, they look at you and say, are you properly dressed? Do you smell like alcohol?
Absolutely.
Because this is Sunday, you're out last night. If you smell anything like alcohol or look like you got a hangover, you go home. You don't do community work if you're half drunk. So that discipline. And so those were the little organizing things that we learned. In the meantime, some of us were then called to say, look, you're clearly interested in this political stuff. And then we were put into what is called the reading groups, which the kind of affluent people understood many years. We didn't have those things, and we were introduced into reading groups. And what did we read? Eventually we read the Marx and Engels like everybody else. But the first thing in my reading group, we read a book called Time Longer Than Rope by Eddie Roux. And it was a book basically on the history of the ANC or the history of resistance of South Africa up to a certain point. Difficulty was, it was in English. I was 18 years old and English wasn't my first language and I struggled to read the book. So after about 2 weeks, and Johnny Eastle was a very hard man. And I was so scared to go to the reading group because I couldn't get past page 2. Eventually I thought I must just confess to him that I just can't read this book. And he just looked at me and said, try reading the last chapter first and move back. That was rather odd, but I went home and I did it. And
Imagination.
I read the whole book.
Yeah.
And then the other book we read, very briefly, was a book called Organizing People for Power. Permanent Cloud, The Struggle for the Philippines.
Yes.
And that book teaches you how to be humble, how to be a leader. It teaches you how to be prepared in a way the Scouts doesn't. And so you learn to be everything to everybody in a situation where you are called upon to lead. Shooting the elephant reminded me of that. Because that's where that guy had to make decisions. When he had to, in a sense, subconsciously lead a community that was hostile.
Yeah.
Not only to the elephant, but to him.
In that case, yes. But
Yeah.
in the Philippines book, he won more and more people. If my look, it's 40 years ago, possibly. But he won more and more sport.
In the Philippines book, it's about the basic strategy and tactics of organizing community.
That's right.
And the one thing that stands out was when these two organizers came to our house when the woman was having a baby. And they had to deliver the baby. And they had no medical knowledge, but they delivered the baby.
They did what they had
And
to.
the essence was, when you are called upon to serve, you serve.
Yeah.
You ask questions later. So yes, those are
The interesting thing is that thousands of people read those two books. It was not, they weren't unconsciously chosen.
No.
Yeah. And the intellectual and academic training that went along with the practice of driving change was conscious and intense. It was quite an interesting time.
I think, Rav, a lot of people would take different things out of it. But the one thing that I think stands out, certainly in these reading groups, in drawing of the maps, in the opportunity to be part of a group that works for change, in a time when we did not have resources. Out of 100 people, there's one person with a car. Nobody has a phone, there's no cell phone, nobody has money. And so you were called upon to be resourceful, you were called upon to be creative, you were called upon to lead. And the more important thing, referring to an earlier point you made, that I think my generation took with us, is the strength of the values, the ethics, the morality that came with it, because none of this was about us.
And we were never paid.
Exactly. None of this was about us. And so you know, you can reflect years later about Marxist-Leninism and the role of the Politburo, the democratic centralism, whether these things work in hindsight 50, 55 years later. You know, you can discuss that. But you can never throw away the values those things brings with it. And so imagine when Peter Mokaba in 87 says, by then, I mean, we formed the South African Youth Congress, but the generation of us who formed it was in jail at the launch of Peter Mokaba, and then became the leaders. And Peter wrote these brilliant pieces about the youth must learn dialectical and historical materialism. We believed it because it gives you the grounding of the theory of change for the working class. And then, post-liberation, the next piece Peter Mokaba writes is, the youth must learn. What must the youth learn? The youth must learn free enterprise. An absolute shocker, not judging the thing, an absolute shocker of the transition at a time when there was no pressure to look at that. And it started, and also we then had, no reflection on anybody I've mentioned so far, we then had a leadership in the post-90s where even the youth leadership was associated not with bravery, values, and hard work, but was associated with glamour of dress, glamour of hairstyle, social functions where you go to. For me, if you look at that generation of the 90s, late 90s, we eventually went on to become, maybe still are, ministers and senior civil servants and others. That is what defined, I believe, them. The need to keep up appearances, the need to have the Armani, what.
And the impact on delivery?
I think the later generation was driven by a different set of values, because by the time that generation came, there was money, there was access to resources, and there was the possibility for business. Not judging the generation, I think the challenge for exiles, the challenge for urban islanders, the challenge for people in the UDF, in the mass democratic movement, who came from nothing and suddenly had authority, suddenly were able to be kingmakers and connectors. They would sell these things for a bottle of champagne. I mean, you know, Sports Unity was sold out like that. They just fed the Sakos people food and gave them trips overseas, and there was no change in sport. Similarly, when our leaders started getting access, they had nothing. And so when Brett Keppel and others offered them shoes and suits. Today in Africa, where I work, big oil contracts,
do the same.
Big gold contracts, big platinum contracts, that's worth multi-billions of US dollars get sold for the education of somebody's child at Oxford. Yeah. And so the principle is that people may not be inherently corrupt, but some of those values change when access to power and resources.
So there was this guy in England who said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts. Absolutely. But I want to take a step back.
Yes, please. Because
in this very conversation, for me, it's your personal journey that I'm most interested in, because it demonstrates your value system and the things that you went through. So, come 94, where were you?
Okay, so in 94, I was working at the University of the Western Cape. I was a clerk. I need to tell you a little bit before then. So after school, I couldn't go to university. I studied my degree about 12 years after leaving school. So after school, my father was a laborer, my mother was a domestic and a factory worker. There was no money. And then I got a clerical job at Old Mutual. In the meantime, I was still in the struggle. Comes the 1985 state of emergency, I get arrested. We get released at the end of that year, I get my job back. 6 months later, I get arrested again. I remember it was a lunchtime and I had to meet Ghulam Abu Bakr.
Yeah.
The problem was that in the middle of 96 emergency, the whole UDF leadership, Terra Lakota, Popo Molefe, Nos Chikani, Trevor Mania, all of them were in jail. So in the Western Cape, all of the leaders were in jail. So I get this message that I had to join what was called the next layer. So they kind of regrouped the UDF leadership, and I'm the kind of young guy on the thing. It only lasted 2 days for me, because 2 days later at work I had to go on. Gulam phoned to say I must meet him. So I take the city bus in my lunch hour. I say to my colleagues, I'm going on lunch. And as I get into the car where Gulam is, the cops jump over me and arrest both of us. That's a story on its own, because at that moment the cops creates the impression with Gulam that I brought them there.
Yeah.
And they separate us.
Yeah.
So Gulam leaves, gets locked up with the impression I brought the cops to you. In any event, we did meet later that night in the prison so I could settle it.
Yeah.
Be that as it may, I then get released a year later, and then gets back to work, and Old Mitchell basically says, look, we can't fire you, it's too political, but you can't take responsibility because you keep on going to jail. So they put me with the messengers. Obviously I resign, I get a job with an organization called ERIC, which is the resource center, situated then at the university. Not sure before long, a few months of working there, my job was to organize students. I was back in jail a few months later. Then even ERIC as an NGO then began to say to me, look, you've got to look for another job because we can't rely on you. You keep on going. These were comrades. Comrades. We can't rely on you. You need to go and find another job. Fortunately, there was a guy that came from exile that I knew from nowhere, who worked at the university as HR manager. And Gulam Abu Bakr was the advisor of Jake Gerwel at the time. And Gulam said to me, go speak to this guy. Who was he? Alan Taylor.
Yeah, I remember Alan Taylor.
And I met Alan Taylor, and he changed my life. Alan gave me an opportunity. I started at the university, worked myself up there, and by '94 I was at the university. During that time, the exile started coming back. So Jake Gerwel would ask me to do things. You know, I would, when Tata Sisulu came out, I was his driver for a week.
Okay.
It was such a privilege. It was so nice because I had to take him for lunch, and he said, where do you live? Let me eat at your house. So I got to the house, and he was, I got these pictures of him and my daughter when she was like a few months old. It was beautiful. And so in '94 I was at the university, working in the administration. Then Trevor Manuel said to me, look, we need you to work in the election office. And I went to Jake's Gerwel, and Jake said, it's fine, just go and help them. So I worked in the election press and PR office for the last, I saw you there in the office, for the last 2 months of the elections. And then of course we lost that election. Nobody really analyzed afterwards. I would have been like to be part of that discussion.
So some people did, even before, but we
lost that election dismally.
Talk about that before the time.
And a lot of subsequent elections, probably not learning from the mistakes.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I did that. I went back to university, and then somewhere in '96, I got a call from a guy called Farid Abdullah, who was a DDG in the health department, wanted me to come and work for Ibrahim Rasool. The long and short of it was I didn't want to go, but I eventually went. And then after about 2 years there, the provincial government of Unity collapsed. And it's a coincidence because within a month or two I met Trevor Manuel at a party, and he asked me to come and work for him, which I also declined initially, but eventually ended up there. And I must tell you that those were the best years of my life. Working for Trevor Manuel was probably the best thing that could have ever happened to me. Trevor Manuel has got a work ethic, he's got an empathy, got a strategic mind, and he's one hell of a slave driver.
Well, I
And
have to
I've
tell you
learned
this,
so much from him.
that I told him I was seeing you today, and he sent his best wishes, and he says it's time that you catch up.
Okay.
So, yeah, some of the stories you told, he was reciting to us that day.
He did.
Yeah.
We've had some good times together. It's interesting because Trevor Manuel, I never thought I'd eventually work for him, or also with him in a sense. Because when I got involved in politics as a young person, we had to do pamphlets and so on and so on. And Trevor worked for this NGO called
Yes, I remember.
Education, Resource and Information Center. So we had to take a train to Salt River, then walk to find this guy, Trevor Manuel. And he would sit there and they had those Roneo machines. So we used to take a stencil. And because we didn't have a typewriter, we used to write a pamphlet. And then we take it to him and he makes 200 copies. And we take the train back and then we had to give it out.
Absolutely.
And I had to start a youth movement. I had to start, Johnny Easel instructed me to start, well, he instructed a few of us, but my job was to start a youth movement in a place where I knew nobody.
Which was where?
In Mitchell's Plain, Rocklands.
Okay, Rocklands.
And because my family moved to Mitchell's Plain, but I stayed in a lower park to finish my schooling. And I had to go to Trevor to go and do it. That's how I met him. And then years later, we ended up spending a good couple of months together in the same prison cell. And later, when Trevor was secretary of the Cape Area Housing Action Committee, and there was the UDF and so on, the Cape Youth Congress was one of Trevor's main kind of bases that secured that he remains in the leadership of the Western Cape UDF. And so I've always kind of had some relationship with him over the years. I think my relationship with him and the values I got from him, learned from him, was quite mostly in the Ministry of Finance. Because I must tell you, incredible insight. Look, he does come across and can be arrogant. He's quite tough. Seriously good judgment. Two cases I want to cite here. I know we're not talking about him, but
Okay, but
two cases I want to cite with you. So we got onto a plane one day and there's this guy. This guy says, Minister, blah, blah, blah. And Trevor just ignores the guy and sits down. And, I go back to coach because I must travel at the back. He's the minister. He said, but this thing bothered me. So I go to the front. I said, now Trevor and I had this thing when we are alone together and we talk informally. I don't call him minister, of course. Beyond that, it's just a professional relationship. So I said, Trevor, listen, you're the Minister of Finance. I don't think you must be rude with people. That man genuinely greeted you, he admires you. He says, yes, he's Brett Cabell, he's a crook. So just leave me. I didn't know who Brett Cabell was. There was no indication in the world that Brett Cabell was a crook. He was a successful businessman.
Lawyer at Hoffman.
And years later, Brett Cabell became the Cabell. I'm not sure if I mentioned the next name, but I want them just to be safe. A few years later, I get a call from an MEC in the Free State. And this guy phones me, because now I'm Trevor Manuel spokesman, everybody knows this, and this guy phones and he says, but he's trying to left messages for the minister, blah, blah, blah. Eventually I go to the minister and say, Minister, there's a certain John who's complaining that he cannot get hold of you and he really needs to talk to you about I think Maria Ramos was also in the office there, and he looks at me and he says to me in Cape Town lingo, that young was a scam. Don't even try to put him through to me. I don't want to talk to him. He's rotten to the core. They have never heard of them. 10, 15 years later, the other guy got a heavy jail sentence for the stuff.
Okay.
That, so he's got a great instinct. Great instinct.
So you went from there?
From there, I then, so the treasury was while I went from a director, eventually I became the chief operating officer, worked well with Maria Ramos. Treasury did very well. And then there were a lot of changes, and I felt at that point, by about 2006, I personally started to grapple with the fact that the broader macroeconomic policy wasn't bringing the poverty relief, it wasn't bringing the redistribution. That's not the reason I left, it's just that I just felt that the leadership at Treasury should begin to think differently.
We won't go into any of the battles you had there now.
No. But Pravin Gordhan, who was the chair, the Commissioner of SARS at that point, by then tried to persuade me to come there to run his communications and international outfit. So I eventually decided it's time for a change. I joined SARS 2006. By 2008, Pravin Gordhan and South Africa by then also still had a great international profile. And Pravin Gordhan was the chairman of the WCO, the World Customs Organization, and he also was the chair of the Forum on Tax Administration, which was a body of developed country tax administrations. And the theme, the international theme around the world in taxation was something called enhanced relationship, where the relation between tax and taxpayers is less conflictual.
Yeah.
And that was part of the theme that Pravin and SARS introduced, where tax paying became something that is the right thing to do. And in 2008, the OECD requested South Africa to host a tax center for Africa. And Pravin asked my opinion, we had a discussion, and I didn't think that South Africa has the right to establish a tax center for Africa without the Africans, the rest of Africa. I also didn't think that it's right for the OECD to establish a tax center for Africa. Less right for South Africa to do it. And so we proposed that we convene a meeting of African countries to ask, how do we deal with taxation?
And this led you to
And this led us to the formation of ATAP, the African Tax Forum, in 2008, launched in 2009. Today, 2018, we are 9 years old, 38 countries are members, trained 15,000 people. We brought in over $200 million in income for about 7 of our member countries. We've got about 15 African design products,
just
all of that. So
$200 million of income. Is that money that you recovered, or money that you stopped leaving? What was that?
That was money that was due to the fiscus in those countries, but was never going to be collected because those countries didn't have the right tax laws, or they did not have the skills to audit the companies or the individuals.
So that's at the heart of what you've done.
Yes. We formed a tax organization for Africa that builds capable tax authorities in Africa in order to allow countries to collect revenues that the economy produces through economic activity. Now, in the rest of the world, the ratio of taxation to the gross domestic product in Europe is 35% tax to GDP. The world average is around 29%. The South African average is 27%. The African average, by the time we started, was 12%. Our challenge was to increase Africa's share of revenue collection, because what was the characteristics of Africa? It had a budget that it could not fund. Taxation in many African countries could only fund between 0 and 15% of what they spend. The rest is aid or loans. Our job was to increase the domestic contribution to a budget. And so today the average tax to GDP ratio in Africa is between 18 and 20%.
Very significant change.
Nigeria, 4 years ago, non-oil, 3%. Today, we've been running a program there for 3.5 years. Today, it's at 12%. Now, these numbers may not mean anything to everybody, but to move your tax to GDP ratio by 2% can take you 5 to 6 years.
Yes, but also can you just, in the Nigerian case, from the 3 to the 12, How much money is that in dollars or in rands? It makes it easier if we hear the number.
I can probably only speak in percentage because the naira is but difficult to count.
Okay, then in naira.
So look, I think if you say from 3 to 12% tax to GDP, it also tells you that it's a 9% increase significantly in revenue. It's quite important because in countries where citizens don't pay tax, they don't ask questions of the state. So nobody bothers about corruption. Nobody bothers about women's rights or environment. Nobody bothers about potholes and human rights abuses because there's a disconnect. Because whatever the state does, they do with other people's money. They get aid or they get loans, and some few percent of the population pays tax. There's an absolute disconnect. But so broadening the tax base is part of the political message that we introduced. Although we're not a political structure, but we introduced, one of the first things we do when we work in a country is to say that company income tax is the biggest portion of your current tax regime. But the thing you must broaden is your personal income tax base. Because although it gives you less, that is where you breed a culture of compliance and citizenship. And when you do that, the country becomes more transparent and accountable, and they spend the money.
So your impact is way beyond the $200 million.
Oh yes, oh yes.
Yeah, and that's what I was hoping to get to. So the financially very significant achievements, and from what you're saying, culturally and socially very significant achievements, towards a transparency and probably a more entrenched and informed democracy, I hope, is what your efforts are leading you to. When you look back over your journey, you've spoken about your time in Treasury as one of the highlights. But what kept you working? You've not been one of those people who pursued vast quantities of money. You had all opportunity to do that. You've not chased positions of power politically. But you've done the work, you've done the hard work. What kept you on the road? What kept you doing just that?
I don't know, I think one's upbringing really gives you the foundation. So my reflection on my upbringing is not I was poor, therefore I did this. I think my upbringing made me strong, and it made me able to be someone who cannot live for yourself only because we could eat because the community had an extra potato and extra rice, or when we had it, we could give it to the community. We exist because of everyone else. I think that is still in me, and like my brother would often say, when are you going to stop trying to save the world? I don't think I saved the world. I'm just a product of such a community, and so I think part of what drives me, and I would say my generation, is I think we come from the generation of what the old people would call the royal we. There's never an I, and it will always be like that. And so when the Zambian president gets elected, comes in and cancels the export of minerals, and the whole world collapses and says, you can't do this. And 2 years later, the company capitulates and gives them billions of dollars in stolen money, then you realize the value of your work, because we rewrote the rules for that country. We're the ones who pointed out how much they lose. And there's somebody who took action. When the Tanzanian president fires a whole set of corrupt people, after, amongst others, we pointed out certain things, you see the value of your work. And so I think the impact is not money only, the impact is the transfer of just a view that things must be for the benefit of a good society and public good.
Great. And I have to come back home.
Okay, and I have to have some.
You were engaged for all of their life in the struggles in the country. By most analyses, we've won some, we've lost some. We've done some good things, and we've done some things which we should have done better, and we've done some bad things as a country. What, if you were to choose one or two things that we need to work on, what are they as South Africa?
I would say that we need to come back to the basics of what are important to the citizens. I think we must move a little bit away from the herd mentality. Somebody says the rand, everybody does something to please the rand. Somebody says state capture, everybody. So we can't kind of ruling by headlines. Sadly, those who write the headlines, I don't think are well informed. I think that if we deal with issues of crime, issues of children's rights, rapes, if we deal with some of the stuff that build our organizations, the bread and butter thing, the state has the resources to do that. If we stop trying to please an existing upper class, unapologetically create a proper black middle class, look after the blue collars in a proper way, we're starting to address things and we have resources for that. Second element is, I think that all of us who were in the struggle, whether exile, prisoner, or a mass democratic movement activist, I think that we are still prisoners. I think we are prisoners of our history, because we are not letting the next generation who were born free run things. The second point, I think, is that I believe that many of us, all of us who were in the struggle and who are called upon to lead today, are in fact prisoners of our own history. I think we act and believe that we own that history, but that history is for our future generations. And so, because we were in the struggle or in exile or in prison or in the mass democratic movement, doesn't make us the sole ownership of the future. Doesn't make us the sole owners to govern, to lead, to manage municipalities and provinces and projects and programs and state companies. We live in an era of modernization, of internationalization, of digitization. We need a different generation. And we have put enough people through school, there's enough young people unbeholden by the burden of history that can begin to lead this country. And I think it's time in our country that old men especially, and old activists must begin to relax. You've delivered. Give it to the next generation and they lay the foundation even better for you, because history owes you nothing.
A fair point. And we're at the end of the interview. Do you have any thoughts, any remarks in conclusion?
Probably to say that the one thing we didn't talk about was the Ali connection. And very briefly, I ended up in the Ali program simply because somebody cancelled and they needed the stand-in.
That's not true at all. Yeah, because I read your CV before you came in.
Yes, after somebody cancelled.
No,
but be that as it may, I got onto the Ali program about 3 days before people left for Aspen. I was very fortunate. I really enjoy the values and the programs of Ali learning, because the methods are different. And so I do think that it strengthens, if you come from a set of values, it reignites them, contextualizes them in a way that is not academically structured and MBA based. However, I think that for Ali Africa and for Ali South Africa, we probably need to have a bit of introspection to look at how we apply the principles to the conditions that we want to change. The Ali Africa members are not the global set of millionaires, philanthropists who may want to use money to try and improve, correctly so, the society. We kind of come from the other angle up.
Yeah.
And therefore our approach could potentially be different. And so if you look at the Ali projects, it's often an immense amount of pressure to have these projects. And then in the interest to keep it going, we glorify all sorts of small projects to keep the idea of projects going. I think projects are good, but if you adapt the type of leadership, the type of programs, the type of intervention a little bit more domestically, you probably will be able to develop and support projects differently. And so part of building a good society and part of having the intervention in your base where you live, either nationally or continentally, you do not have to go in at the very top level all the time. You must be able to intervene in a good society at all sorts of levels. And I do think as people like you and others are reconstructing the concept of Ali, we have an absolutely good opportunity to play the role of not being beholden, but building that society from where we are. As abstract as it sounds, I hope it makes sense.
I hope it does. Thank you very much, Logan. It's been wonderful talking to you.
Thank
Good
you.
to connect.
Thank you very much. Then we get the chance to talk about things.